Sensory and perceptual development. Now, in our earlier training, and I keep referencing that because I don't want you guys to think that we never had one. We did have an earlier training, and we went into each of these, okay, separately. But these are the areas that have been studied and looked at. Of course, vision has the most research. Okay, really been studied a lot. Olfaction, just want you to know some of the terms when we talk about olfaction research. That's sense of smell. Okay, gustation is taste. Audition, so if somebody needs an auditory exam, or the mother says that he's being referred for an auditory exam, you know that that's hearing. Okay, which is really important. You guys you need to know what the child is being referred to, if that's maybe a problem. Tactician and haptic perception is having to do with touch and balance and kind of understanding where their body is in space. And vestibular is not so much touch, but it's more motion and balance. So when you're moving and being able to balance your body, and that could be very difficult for children that are blind or visually impaired, because we really use visual cues hugely for that. There's been a lot of research with that. And then pain is another area which now is considered a sense modality, so it's usually separated out from the other senses. So we're going to highlight these, what we know about the development of sensory systems. And again, we went into detail on each of them, so this is just a recap of that. Touch, pain, smell, taste, hearing, and vestibular sensitivity are all well developed at birth. Okay, touch is an important component of several adaptive reflexes, has important social effects as well. And we know that babies use touch to explore their environment, so it's not just random, purposeless movement. They're exploring the environment, and the more control they have over their muscles, they're able to actually move about, okay, which is important. We want children to explore their environment, right? And we know that touch is very important. It's important not only just for infant mental health, which we're going to have in another training for bonding, but we already talked about it with the rooting reflex, right? And it has a lot of social effects as well, as far as soothing and those kind of things. So we know that touch is important for human beings. As far as taste, we know that newborns prefer sweet taste. So if you've ever actually tasted breast milk, it's really, really sweet. And they do respond to both position and movement. Okay, so when we talk about vestibular sensitivity, it's not so much that they're controlling the vestibular system, but they're sensitive to it. So that's why when you alter the position, you know, they may like that, right? So you put them on your lap with a pillow and you're kind of shifting back and forth. They like that. They like the movement. Okay, so they're very sensitive to it, and that's what that's indicating, vestibular sensitivity. So when you put them on your shoulder, you rock them in your arms, we put them in the baby swings, right? And that works wonders. Okay. And okay, a little bit more here. Yeah. And we had a training that went over just the vision part, because again, we're an agency, that's our specialty. So that may be something that if you guys haven't had yet, that we may want to have at some point, that talks about the whole visual system, the other training. But what we know, again, about these sensory systems is we know that the visual system, though, is not fully developed at birth. Okay. However, by about a year, visual acuity, which is our ability to see details, so being able to focus in on people's faces and pick up details in the environment, that's visual acuity. And by about a year, it's pretty much equal, not quite, but pretty much equal to most adults as far as development. But we do know very early on is no, they are not seeing that it's not fully developed. Okay, so all of those pastel colors that we put in the nursery and the mobiles that are, you know, lime green and light blue, that doesn't really aid in development. What you need is a lot of bright contrasting colors, okay, which are red, black, and white usually together. And we went into detail with some of those visual patterns when we covered the first training as to what their preferences are. Okay. We know that color vision is limited, but usually around 6 months it's almost fully developed. And depth perception is present at about 3 months. And depth perception is, you know, significant to human beings getting around the environment. In one of our trainings that we go into the visual system, we talk about depth perception and the difference in our two eyes. There's a reason that our eyes are the way they are, that there's just a couple inches between, because you actually get two images. It's not the same image for each eye, and they fuse together in the brain. And when they fuse together, that's how we see in 3 dimensions. Otherwise, actually, the image is just 2-dimensional that's in our eye. So the fact that we can drive, we can get around the environment has to do with the design of our eyes. So that's an important function. Peripheral vision, which means here. So even though I'm not looking out here, I'm still picking up stimuli that's out here to the side of me. That's peripheral. It just means to the side. When we talk about central vision, it's right in the center in front. Okay, peripheral vision is equivalent to adults by 6 months. And there's different cells involved in each of these. There's cells that are involved in these, cells that are different for color vision, and cells that are involved for visual acuity. Okay, and our visual system training, we go into detail about all the different cells, but they're underdeveloped here. Okay, but actually they catch up pretty quick, which is a good thing. And we do know with infants, and a lot of data, again, especially in the visual system, a lot of research in that area, visual development, that infants show an interest in face-like stimuli. Okay, so some of those baby videos now, they're finding that are so great. You know, a lot of them, they're putting faces, right? Okay, so we know. And also, preference for visual patterns and high contrast. Now again, with infants, we can't ask them what do they prefer, which one they like, can they see this one? You can't ask the infant, so it's really just observation. We're monitoring where their gaze is, what they're looking at. Okay, and we're recording that. So they will stay looking longer at something that looks like a face, resembles a human face. They will stay looking longer and show a preference, when given a choice, a preference for visual patterns that have high contrast. So checkerboards, you know, which is like people give, you know, black and white dots and checkerboards, because they prefer those kinds of stimuli. Okay, we're going to move into cognitive development review. And again, our earlier training, we went into all these theories more in depth. We know that there's a lot happening in the brain, despite which historically at one point people thought there wasn't much happening going on. There really is a lot happening. Okay. A term I'd like you to know called arborization. Arbor coming from tree, meaning tree. This is what we call what's happening in the brain. It's called arborization. And if you think of your brain, if you've ever actually seen a picture of the brain and inside and what the cells look like, it really resembles kind of like a tree that's branching out and flourishing, and the branches are starting to connect to more branches. And during early childhood, we see a growth in these branches. Okay, and they're actually called neurons, and they're called axons, the branches part of the neuron. So if you ever have a class that talks about brain development, the central nervous system, the brain and spinal cord, and how that works. You can definitely learn more about that. It's very interesting to see how the brain develops. But we call the process arborization. It's this branching process where there's new connections that are being made. It's very important for learning. And we do know that as we age, the opposite happens. So as we're young children, we see a lot of this arborization occurring. And then over time, as we get older, it's like what happens to a tree, basically. There's less of it, okay? And we see more atrophy of the branches. They're coming in. There's less connections. So if you look at the brain of an older adult versus a child in middle school, it's vastly different. Okay. Now there's different theories about cognitive development. I'm sure Jean Piaget, you've probably heard of. In his stages of development. There's also an information processing theory, and Lev Vygotsky is also another, Lev Vygotsky, I forget his first name, is another theory that's been around for some time. And Piaget, this is just Piaget in a nutshell because we went over it in detail last time. Piaget proposed that it's not just that adults are smarter and know more, but adults think differently. Children think differently, adults think differently. And his theory is very elaborate. It has a lot of new terms that we had never heard of before when it was introduced. It goes into a great deal of detail. I would recommend that you maybe review it if you haven't in a while. But the whole premise of his theory has to do with children developing internalized frameworks that helps them organize material. Okay, and they're internalized so we don't see them. So we're talking about something that we really can't see or observe, but we believe is taking place. He called the organized framework schemas. He also talked about processes that help organize the material, assimilation and accommodation. Do all of these sound familiar? Okay. And his theory is a stage theory of cognitive development, so there's a sequence, okay, that children go through as far as development. And all of these sequences involve assimilation and accommodation. And all of them involve developing schemas. Okay, but very different in terms of what they're able to do at each stage.